Next up on page 19, you're going to see basically where it talks about the gear ratios. I don't know if you noticed, but when I was putting the motor together, I did not put the pulley in the motor. Even though it says that that was the right time to do it, you know, I wasn't 100% sure that that was the pulley I was going to run, so I kind of skipped that step. Generally, if you're doing mild 3D, nothing really hard, and you have a 1200 kV motor, the stock pulley is perfect. With an 1100 kV motor, the stock pulley will be a little sluggish, but it'll still be okay for sport flying. If you have a higher kV motor like 1350 or so, the stock pulley, be careful because it might be a little too much head speed. So look at the recommendations here on page 19 where it talks about what's the right pulley for the application that you're looking for. For now, I'm going to use the stock pulley. I just made up my mind. I'm going to set this up as a mild sort of sport flying helicopter. So I'm going to use the stock pulley, which is right here. It's an 18 tooth. So moving on, the next step here would be on page 20 would be to install your ESC. And I'm not going to do that for now because I don't have an ESC yet to put in here. But basically you would put the ESC right here. You would strap it with the zip ties like I was telling you before when we built the battery tray down below, the main plastic tray down below. And then you would route the wires of the ESC through one of these holes. So since I made my motor so that the motor wires would come out of the right side of the helicopter, I would run the ESC wires right through this hole, up and around here, and the motor wires would end up being here, and that's what these two holes are for, so that you can run a zip tie and hold those wires in place. So basically you would install your ESC at this point. But I'm going to go ahead and after that, because I don't have a BSC, the next step is to install the motor. Again, you might want to have some connector solder here at this point. But I'm going to go ahead and mount this motor. This is again the Quantum 1200 kV. It's a 4120. And this one's got the right side shaft for this pulley. As you can see, the pulley fits in right perfectly. This bushing that comes with the kit is to allow the pulley to work with motors that have a 5mm shaft instead of a 6mm shaft. So the Quantum motor's got the right size shaft and already has a flat in it. The shaft length is perfect. So I'm going to go ahead and mount my pulley here real quick. And generally what I do when I mount the pulley is I make sure that I have the set screw right in the flat. But I don't tighten the set screw all the way, simply because I want to be able to move the pulley up and down once I get my motor belt in, to make sure the motor belt is running at the right height. If the pulley is too low, the belt will be running low. If the pulley is too high, the belt will be running high. So I want to leave this a little bit on the loose side, just like that, so I can move it up and down. And then I'm going to go ahead and mount the motor to the helicopter now. Before I do that, I'm going to put the belt, which should be on back 7-1, the motor belt. It's right here. I'm going to put the motor belt around the motor pulley because it makes it a lot easier to mount it on the main pulley on the helicopter later. So I'm going to go ahead and do this, and then I'm going to mount the motor just like so. And you got to be really careful here because you have those two springs that are helping you create the tension on the motor. So you don't want to lose those springs and have to redo this again. So I think there it is. So I'll push all the way in and I try to get the belt to go around the main pulley in the back of the helicopter. Sometimes it's difficult because these springs compress a lot, so you have to like push really hard. Some people, what they do is they just, on the bigger machines, is they tighten these knots. They push all the way down, they tighten one of the nuts so they don't have to push in while they install their belt. So the belt is in, and the next step here is to tighten these two nuts right here that hold the motor. So this is a pretty good tension right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tighten these knots until I have hardly any room left to tighten, and then I'm going to pull back on the motor a little bit to get even a little bit more tension on my belt, and then I'm going to finish tightening these nuts all the way. Alright, I'm at that point where I'm ready to tighten the nuts all the way. So I'm going to pull back a little bit on the motor, and I'm going to go ahead and finish tightening the two nuts. There we go. Now I'll tighten the other one. Oh, not good. My wrench slipped. There we go. And you want to check your belt tension. Just use common sense. The main belt should be much tighter than the tail belt. That is for sure. The main belt has to be snug to the point where it's not sort of banjo tight, but it needs to be pretty tight. The tail belt, not so much. We're going to talk about tail belt here in a minute. But again, the main belt needs to be tight. Now we need to go ahead and put the two bolts that go right here, that hold the motor, the front side of the motor, and then tighten them up. And those bolts should be on bag 7-1. So bag 7-1 has these two little screws right, these two little bolts right here with the two washers. And these two washers this is what's going to support the motor in the front right here. So you don't have to tighten those a whole lot. You just need to use a little bit of Loctite, and they're basically there as a guide to hold the motor in place. But you don't need, obviously they need to be tightened, but you don't have to like overdo it. So I'm going to go ahead and put these in here real quick. Okay, finally, you want to make sure that your motor belt is riding in the right position, not too high, not too low. So what you do is spin the motor a few times in the direction of where the motor will be spinning. Make sure the head is rotating clockwise when seen from above. And just do that a few times and look at your belt. Look at the motor belt, how it's riding on the main pulley. And you want to see a little bit of pulley on the high side and on the upper side of the pulley, and you want to see also a little bit of pulley on the lower side, a little bit of pulley left on the lower side, under and above the belt, I mean to say. If the belt is too low, just move your motor pulley up and do this again. If it's too high, move your motor pulley down and do this again, and find that sweet spot. And when you got that sweet spot, just go back here and make sure that you tighten your motor pulley all the way. So mine is riding perfectly, so I'm going to go ahead and crank on this set screw a little bit, make sure it's tightened all the way, and we're good to go. So that's it for page number 21, the motor belt. And then we're starting to get into the part where you're supposed to start building your installing your electronics. I personally don't install the boom on the helicopter until the very end. I'm going to do it this time just because I want to demonstrate the whole build. But basically what I would do at this point is I would actually take my flabberless system and mount it here. I would route my servo wires. So for example, on the right servo, I would run the wire under this plate right here, under the servo plate. And then I would put a little piece of tape and hold it onto this servo right here. And on this side, I would take this wire and run it on top of the servo here, and I would put a piece of tape right here. And then I would make sure that all three wires are coming in the back side of the helicopter nice and neat. And I would coil them up just like so. And then I would put like one of the hook and loop sort of small velcros to hold the wires and make sure they're nice and neat here in the back side of the helicopter. And what I would do is I would mount my flabberless system, and I would mount since the tail servo would be mounted at this point, I would route the tail servo wire right through in here inside the frame through this area. And as you can see, you have little holes right here that you can use to zip tie the wires to the tail servo wire through the inside of the frame. So I would run my tail servo wire out top here, and then obviously my BEC would be mounted here. So my BEC wire would be routed, the throttle wire would be routed through here, and you might possibly need an extension for that. Route the wire through the inside of the frame, through here, and go up here, so it's accessible to be plugged into your flabberless system. Again, on this side of the frame, you also have little holes that you can use to zip tie the wire up inside the frame. And make sure the wires are not hanging in here. Make sure they're zip tied to the inside of the frames, because your tail belt will be riding in here. So make sure there's no wires in the way of your tail belt. One other thing is, when you route the wire from the ESC up, make sure you route it, make sure that you don't run it through this hole right here. Make sure you go back and up and around through this back hole right here. And the reason for that is your battery tray, your removable battery tray, is going to go inside and lock this. So if you have a wire here, you're going to pinch it with the battery tray. So some things to keep in mind. If you have a flybarless system that requires a separate unit, so in other words, like a two-system unit like the Futaba CGY 750 or the Mikado V-Bar full size and so forth, you would mount the sensor right here upside down, and then you would mount your control unit up top so you can reach in and plug in your servos. If you have a mini V-Bar or an Icon or a Brain or a Skookum or any of those units that are a single piece, you just mount it right here and plug everything into it. If you have a BEC, you can mount the external BEC right here. You have a couple of little nice little retaining, I guess you could say, pieces that you can use to zip tie around, or use a little O-ring to hold your BEC in place, or a receiver battery if you needed a small, like say 800 milliamp 2-cell receiver battery. You could mount your receiver if you needed a receiver, which is the case, for example, for all those Futaba S-Bus people. You can mount the receiver, for example, right here or on one of these two sides on the side frames, right here or here. So I mean, there's a lot of mounting possibilities on this helicopter. So I'm not going to mount the flybarless system, but I'm going to mount the support for the flybarless system, and that, according to page 22, is on back 7.2 right here. Basically, it's a carbon fiber tray that supports your flybarless system, and along with that, you have two small little bolts and two little specialty washers. I'm going to put the bolts in the washers and use a number 2mm wrench. Right here. Now, in an ideal situation, what I would do is I would route these wires right in through here, and then I would mount this carbon fiber plate right here, and I would tuck the wires under it. It makes for a really nice and neat installation. And when I'm done with this, I'm going to show you guys how I did it with my other helicopters, my 500s that are already built. So you get the idea of how I routed the wires and how everything is nicely installed, and the wires are tucked away. So that's your flybarless system tray right there. Now, on page 22, it tells you to do that, and the thing about this is, once you mount this, you cannot reach into these bolts to tighten your boom. So I still do this because like I said before, it's so much easier to manipulate this as you're doing your setup. You can put your flybarless unit, you can have your tail servo in place, you can have your motor wire soldered to your ESC mounted, you can tuck the wires in, you can plug everything, you can bind your radio, do whatever you need to do, set up your throws, set up your head, set up everything, and you leave your tail for last. And again, it's just much more convenient to do this and rotate and play with it, and you can even spool up your motor without having a tail spooled up or anything, you know, with just this piece. But obviously, to insert the boom, we're going to have to remove this again, which is not a big deal. It's only 2 bolts. So for chapter 14, which is the next chapter, we're going to talk about installing the boom, finishing the boom and installing the boom. Now, chapter 14, boom assembly. The first thing we have to do, or I will do, is I will make my tail push rod. Now, according to the manual, you have dimensions to make this rod. And the dimensions in the manual are actually very accurate. I generally recommend people to first finish the helicopter, have everything all done, have the tail inserted, the tail boom inserted under the frames, and have everything completely ready to go before you do this. Why? because every tail servo has slightly different dimensions. The spline might be a little bit farther away from the end of the servo or closer to it, and you might never get the exact, most accurate measurement of your tail push rod until you have everything set up. So I would do this for last, but I'm not going to do it right now, but I'm going to give you a trick on how I do this. First thing I do is I take the, you're going to need back 7.3 or 7-3 and 7-4 for this part. 7-3 has the parts that you need to insert the tail case onto the boom, and 7-4 should have your parts to build the, here we go, your ends for the tail push rod. So if you look at the manual, like I said before, the manual on page 23 gives you very accurate measurements for how to build your tail push rod. It's basically telling you to leave 2 millimeters of exposed rod on each side, and that'll get you really, really close. But like I said before, it's always, in my opinion, best to do this at the very end. So I'm going to show you how I would do this. I would tighten this ball link and turn it enough so that it's not tightened all the way. You want to have some room to loosen it up and some room to tighten it up as well. Then what I would do is I don't personally like to use CA for this. CA gets brittle, and it depends on the part of the world where you live in. You know, in some places it gets so hot that the CA will get so brittle, so cold, sorry, and the CA will get so brittle that it'll eventually fail. I like to use epoxy or JB Weld. So I have epoxy here, and I'm not going to use this for the time being. But basically what I would do is I would pour some deliberate amount of epoxy right here, and I would insert this into here, and I would just let the epoxy set. And once the epoxy is set and this is tight, the next thing I would do is I would actually take a small piece of sanding paper, and I would sand probably the last inch of the rod. And then what I do is I take a little bit of CA, and I put a little bit of CA between the carbon rod here and the metal rod, and then I take sawing thread, just like this, and then I wrap the sawing thread around this many times. So I'll start like turning like this and wrap it around it just like that, and put a deliberate, just put a lot of sawing thread, and make sure the sawing thread goes to the rod, to the metal rod, and to the carbon rod. And once that's set in there and it's all nice and neat, all wrapped around it, then what you do is you take CA again and you whip the CA on the sawing thread, and that'll get really strong. Remember, you do not want to play with this. This is critical. If one of these things break loose in flight, you're going to crash, more than likely. So take this rod assembly very seriously. I've seen people, for example, with logos, and even with Goblins themselves, you see more logos because they've been around for longer, fail to glue this properly, and this will like separate, and now you have a rod that is longer than it needs to be, and you don't have any more tail control, and the tail you hit throttle hold is not going to stop pirouetting because your tail has deflection, pitch deflection in it. So do it as I said. I think that's the best method. Other people use a brass or a copper or something sleeve, and after they've basically epoxy the rod into the carbon rod, they'll slide a sleeve onto it and put a little bit of glue before they do. That works as well. I just like the sawing thread because it's simple. You can find sawing thread everywhere. It doesn't matter if it's not the perfect diameter or whatever. And then once I'm done with that, so it doesn't look so bad because it'll look kind of ugly, then you just get some just standard like heat shrink, and just take a little piece of heat shrink and cut it to the right dimension, you know what I mean, and then just put it in there and heat shrink it, and it'll look nice and neat. Nobody will know that you have an ugly bunch of sewing thread under your tail push rod. So that's for the building or the the assembly of the tail push rod. I'm going to kind of assemble this sort of just for demonstration purposes, but I'm not going to glue it. Now on to the boom. We're going to take our boom right here. And our tail case is built from the chapter before, as you can remember. Here's our tail case right here. So the first step here is we're going to go ahead and in back 7-3 we have some double-sided tape, and we have 2 pieces of double-sided tape, and we have these 2 pieces of carbon with nuts built into them, and then we have 4 bolts with 4 washers. I'm going to stick the bolts inside the washers, and then we have another smaller bolt, and the smaller bolt, and this piece of plastic. This piece of plastic is a guide for your tail push rod, and it goes inside the boom. Basically goes in this hole right here. But before we stick it in there, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that bolt and I'm going to put it inside here, and I'm going to tighten it. Why am I going to do this? I'm going to tighten it all the way because it'll open up the plastic a little bit. Sometimes if you try to put this inside the boom before you do this first, you're going to have a hard time trying to tighten this. It's not going to want to go through the right, it's not going to want to reach, go through that hole. So go ahead and do that and then pull it out. And then I'm going to go ahead and open this, the opening where the tail push rod goes in. I'm just going to open it a little bit with the pliers because it's usually pretty tight. Now you want to be careful here, very, very lightly, because you don't want to break this piece. If you break this piece, you might not be able to find one right away. Just like that, just very careful. Then I'm going to insert this onto the boom, just like that. And hopefully this bolt will go right to where it needs to go because I already enlarged the plastic a little bit. You don't need to use CA or anything. This will stay there. There's nothing to be CAing or Loctiting or anything. Perfect. That's it. The next step is I'm going to go ahead and peel the double-sided tape from these things and put the double-sided tape on the carbon pieces. So one right here. Make sure the holes are aligned as well. One right here. That wasn't perfectly aligned, but it should work. And then the other one. Okay, then you peel the other side of the tape, and the next step is to put these carbon pieces inside the actual boom itself. So like so. And you got to make sure that obviously the holes are lined up. And you know, sometimes what it helps is you take the bolt with the washer that you already put in, and you just stick the bolt in the hole in here in the boom, and then you try to tighten it onto the nut a little bit, and that makes sure that you're 100% lined up. I rather do it this way because I know it's 100% lined up. It's very difficult to kind of see through these holes in the boom and get it perfect. And what happens is the double-sided tape is meant to be used to kind of hold that piece of carbon fiber inside the boom, but it's not so strong. So eventually, if you don't do this and the holes are not perfectly lined up, when it's time to put your tail case onto the boom, and you start trying to insert these bolts in, what's going to happen is if it's not lined up, you're going to push onto the carbon plate and you're going to detach it from the boom, because again the double-sided tape is not that strong. It's meant to sort of be more of an aid to help you get those things inside and tighten them, but that's about it. What some people do and what I've done in the past is I've actually CA'd these pieces to the boom, which you can do too, but they really don't need to be CA'd. They just need to be, these bolts just need to be obviously engaged onto the nuts. This gives the back side of the boom a lot of strength, so there's no need to use CA on this at all. So, and then once I'm done tightening this, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the bolts, and then I'm going to go ahead and insert the tail case. Okay, now that I removed the bolts, now the two pieces of carbon are inside the boom. So next step is just to insert the whole tail case onto the boom. And generally what I do, the easiest way to do this is I take a piece of tape, and I don't have any other kind of tape handy other than this double-sided tape, which will work, and I'll just cut a little piece off of it, and then I'll just wrap that piece around the tip of the tail belt, just like this. And it just makes it really easy to fish that tail belt through the boom. So you just like literally go like this, and it should go all the way through. I need to let gravity help me here. And there it is, tail belt is on the other side. It's really easy to do it that way. Just be careful not to use tape that is too strong or something, because then you're going to have a hard time removing the tape from the tip of the tail belt. And now I'm ready to go ahead and place these bolts back on here. And now I know that my carbon plates inside the boom are lined up perfectly. So I'm not going to tighten these all the way. I'm just going to tighten them just a little bit. You want to leave these loose, because if you tighten these, then you're going to have to loosen them up again to set your tail belt tension. So I'm just going to go a little bit like that, and the same on this side. And then as you can see here, this moves back and forth, and that's what adjusts your tail belt tension later. I'm going to remove the tape from the tip of this. Done. And that pretty much concludes the tail boom assembly. I'm going to go ahead and take a short break, and then we're going to go ahead and mount the tail boom on the helicopter.